Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our side event entitled Climate Action for Whom? Monitoring Climate Finance for Indigenous Peoples. I am Helen Magata, an Indigenous Kadaklan woman from the Cordillera region of the Northern Philippines. I work with the Tebtebba Foundation, or the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy, Research, and Education. Very great to see everyone here, and we are be ready for a very powerful and interesting discussion we have ahead of us. So this session will look at some current and potential future of climate actions and finance that could impact Indigenous peoples positively or also negatively. So last week, we heard about an announcement of pledges of 1.7 billion US dollars for forests and Indigenous peoples. And in this COP, we also hear the states calling for an increased ambition for climate finance, not only for climate mitigation and adaptation, but also for loss and damage. But today we have, as I've said, a very powerful team of speakers in front. Of Indigenous leaders who are going to talk about Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous people's perspectives of climate finance in general, but more specifically about the necessity of monitoring where climate finance goes, so that we see and unpack the challenges of Indigenous peoples in accessing climate finance, in particular Indigenous women, for example, and also see and look at opportunities. We will also hear later from our speakers about the initiatives and experiences of Indigenous peoples who are already experiencing, monitoring climate action and climate finance. So again, welcome to the session. We have 1 hour and 15 minutes to do this very interesting and engaging discussion. So we will give our presenters 7 minutes each to give your presentation, so that we will have more time later for our question and answer. So I'm going to introduce them one by one before they speak. Our first speaker is the Executive Director of Tebtebba, and she's the former UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Vicky Tauli-Corpuz. Vicky, my question is that why is it important for Indigenous peoples to monitor climate finance, and how is this relevant to the now ongoing discussion on Article 6 and how this could contribute to the achievement of the Paris Agreement?
Thank you very much, Helen. Well, first of all, climate finance is really a major agenda item in this COP, because most of the, of course, the developing countries are demanding that the developed countries, the ones who have caused all these problems and who have the money, should really support the poorer countries to be able to mitigate as well as be able to adapt. No, the problem, I just want to give a little overview of where we are at the finance discussions, no, of the negotiation. As you all know, one of the main things that that countries are asking for is finance for loss and damage, no, and you know, many Indigenous peoples are living in the coastal areas where loss and damage is happening. Islands are sinking, water levels are rising, hurricanes are very strong, and yet there's no money, no, for loss and damage. Today, I heard that the UK committed $1 million for loss and damage. That's the first time that there's such a commitment, but that's nothing compared to the need of these people who are in these low-lying islands to really adapt and to the loss and damage that they have been experiencing. You know, these are long-term impacts that you cannot anymore be resilient. You really need to do another kind of process. The other thing, of course, is that many of the So in the loss and damage arena, there is a call to strengthen the Santiago network for loss and damage, which is the network that's supposed to thresh out all the details. This network up to now has never been operationalized. No, so this is one big problem I think indigenous people should look into, and to also look into what are the possibilities to get more money for loss and damage. The second point is, of course, we know that there is money for forest, no, but not much money for intact forests, no. Intact forests, most of the intact forests in the world today are found in indigenous territories, and there should be incentives for indigenous peoples to be able to keep these forests intact, no. And as it is right now, there is not that much money that's really going to intact forests. So now there is a discussion going on about the need to incentivize, the intact forest, because these intact forests keep 11 billion metric tons of carbon. That's what they sequester, and yet the support is not there. So I think that this announcement that there's going to be 1.7 billion dollars for indigenous peoples in relation to forest should really be unpacked even further. Number one, to see, are these really new money or not? Because some of the money that's there from the bilateral donors, that's something that they have allocated, no? Of course, maybe the money from the philanthropic community are new, but we have to monitor. There has to be a transparent listing of where this money is coming from. Is it new or not? And how can indigenous peoples have effective mechanisms to effectively access this money? I always say that, sometimes, at least in the past, up to the present, big conservation organizations, for instance, are the ones who get the big bulk of the money, and crumbs are the ones that go to the indigenous peoples. We have to put a stop to this. No, so that's one issue related to that. But I think that then the monitoring is important, because you will monitor how much really went to indigenous peoples, and how much and how has this been used, to be able to really contribute to meeting the goal of 1.5. No, as I mentioned, the intact forests have to be incentivized to be able to do that. Yesterday, I have some meetings with some scientists, also with some ministers, and for instance, the minister of Suriname was there, and he said that 98% of Suriname are forests, and these are where indigenous peoples live. But there is a gold rush. There is a gold rush, and people are really rushing to go and get the gold in these communities. So what will incentivize the communities to really fight further and protect this forest? Are they going to earn some money by protecting this forest? So I think those are some very concrete things that you see on the ground, which are not yet elaborated in so far as how to monitor. So monitoring is key, no? Monitoring is key when the monies are being announced, but also when there are monies that are going to be used to expand, for instance, protected areas, the 30 by 30 goal. If they're going to expand that, how much money is going to be used. There is this group called People and Planet, which are all philanthropists, and they have committed 5 billion, for achieving the 30 by 30 goal. Again, the question is, and of course, this is again meant for indigenous peoples, no? So the question again is, what kinds of mechanisms will be put in place so that they will really be used to keep the intact forest, to rehabilitate the destroyed forest, and to recover, some of the forests that have been lost from their control. I saw a map, in Paracana Park, which is really very intact, but all the surrounding areas are deforested, no? And the question is, how will we further protect that park? Because that's where big part of the sequestration is happening. And the information I heard also was that in the past, the Amazon used to be a sink. It is the one that absorbs all the greenhouse gas emissions. Now it's not a sink anymore. It has flipped. It's now a source of greenhouse gas emissions. The Congo Basin remains as a sink. Southeast Asia, also a big part also are sinks, but they said that Amazon has flipped. So that's why the Amazon friends, from the Amazon in Latin America are coming here to ask for big money for them to be able to bring this back to become sinks and not sources of greenhouse gas emissions. No, so that's the reason why we want to monitor that. We didn't know that. We thought that the Amazon is still, in that very good state, but that's not what the scientists say. They did it. And finally, maybe just to say, the monitoring is really also very much related, of course, to the traditional systems of indigenous peoples. How are they governing their communities? How are their customary systems being used and put into place? And how are they, of course, how is the traditional knowledge being used and supported for them to be able to continue that kind of those actions? And that's part of the monitoring. It's really the positive efforts of indigenous peoples and not just looking at the negative impacts. And I hope that's what this LCIPP is going to do, to really highlight what the traditional knowledge systems are that are keeping these ecosystems in a better shape, and what kind of traditional knowledge should be supported more strongly and expanded. So thank you very much. I can talk forever about this, but I don't have the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Yeah, Vicky has shared very provocative information and also questions and some recommendations going forward. But I think one of the key things that she mentioned are access of indigenous peoples, transparency, and also looking at climate finance that is not separate from indigenous peoples' practice of the traditional livelihoods, traditional knowledge. So it's not really separate from rights of indigenous peoples. So our second speaker is the Executive Director of Indigenous Livelihoods Enhancement Partners from Kenya. He's a Maasai brother. So Kimaren, I'd like to ask you about your ongoing initiative of the Indigenous Navigator project. How is this working? Can you tell us about it, and how could this work in terms of helping monitor climate financing for indigenous peoples?
Thank you very much, Helen, and good afternoon to everyone. Great having you here. It is really a privilege to have the opportunity to bring lessons from the ground to these global spaces. And I think before I share what the Indigenous Navigator is all about, it is useful to appreciate the rationale for why the Indigenous Navigator came about. So one of the reasons why the Indigenous Navigator was born is one, on the realization that most of these global mechanisms, UN systems, the human rights system, the climate system, the biodiversity arrangement, and all these others, and the climate finance, each of them has an aspiration for monitoring and accountability. So the UN system has a UPR, the UNFCCC has, say, the Safeguard Information Systems of RED, and the National Forest Monitoring Systems, and the CBD also has, the things like the Outlook and biodiversity reports. And so, and the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, has a policy on indigenous people, which also aspires to be reviewed every 3 years to see the impact. But then the question is, to what extent have these monitoring aspirations been realized in national spaces and on the ground? The second rationale for this is that climate change is an on-the-ground issue. So most of these policy decisions and discourses, the national space is actually an abstract space. Where climate change is felt is on the ground. And people, therefore, who can articulate what is happening are those directly affected by climate change on the ground. The third reason is that most data used to do development, including climate change and including financing, is indigenous people blind. It is data that is aggregated on average and dissolves indigenous peoples into bigger dominant groups, and therefore does not respond to the realities of indigenous people. And so what is the Indigenous Navigator? The Indigenous Navigator is an attempt to respond to the realities I just mentioned. One, it is an attempt by indigenous people to generate data about themselves, for themselves, to be prioritized by themselves, and to be used to feed into these systems. And so it is founded, the other reason actually why the Navigator is there is when you look at the architecture of these mechanisms, it is no longer an issue of non-recognition for indigenous people. It is an issue of what it means to recognize them on paper. And so you have traditional knowledge in the Paris Agreement. You have IP rights in the Paris Agreement. You have full and effective participation in the Cancun decision. You have non-carbon. All these things are actually now in most decisions of the UNFCCC. The Warsaw decision has a component of community-based monitoring information systems. And so the other logic is that while communities are monitoring the environment and making sense of it on a daily basis, their knowledge and their observation is not feeding into these regional and national mechanisms of monitoring. And so the Indigenous Navigator is an attempt to bridge this gap. And specifically, also it is founded on the ILO Convention number 169. It is founded on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so it collects data on traditional knowledge. It collects data on human rights. It collects data on livelihood systems of indigenous communities and tries to speak the language of the system. The system apparently only understands things on paper. And indigenous people are storytellers. And for years, we've talked about our stories and they are hardly heard or understood. And so the Indigenous Navigator is an instrument to generate this data, use it to prioritize our needs. And so in the context of climate change and financing, there is no better place to look at least in the communities and experiences I have, than the Indigenous Navigator, so that the wearer of the shoe knows where it hurts. They will help prioritize the needs that are to be funded. They will help to monitor the extent to which the policy is respected or violated. They will give meaning to the grievance redress mechanisms of these policies. They will show the impact of climate change from the ground. And so I think it is actually an instrument of self-determination, of indigenous people to self-determine what is their priority concerns, how is climate change affecting them, where should resources go, what are the structures of decision-making at the community, and basically, I think, puts them on the driver's seat of the agenda of climate change and solution to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kimaren. And yes, it's really good to hear about this initiative and how it is contributing to the monitoring system, which, as you have said, are usually blind of indigenous people's indicators. So our next speaker is going to add on to what Kimaren has said, although Eileein is going to speak more of the indigenous people's tracker on Green Climate Fund projects. So this is more specific about tracking projects that were approved by the Green Climate Fund that will potentially negatively or positively affect indigenous peoples. But before that, I'd like to introduce Eileein. She is program staff of the Centro para la Autonomia, Desarollo de Pueblos Indigenas in Nicaragua. But before she speaks, we have a short video introduction of the Indigenous Peoples Tracker. So if our friends from the tech team could show the video, please.
As the Green Climate Fund is funding more climate projects, it is critical to look at how it is implemented.
Okay, yeah. Maybe while waiting, I can ask Eileein to already introduce what Eileein to do an introduction of the video and also tell us more about why is there a need to do or to initiate a monitoring of all GCF approved projects.
I'm going to
Yes, it's working.
speak in Spanish because there are some people who ask for. Buenos días a todas y todos. El Fondo Verde para el Clima es el fondo más grande que tiene la Convención Marco de Cambio Climático definido, y realmente consideramos que es muy importante el seguimiento y el monitoreo de qué está pasando en el fondo. Si revisamos los datos hasta ahora, el fondo tiene el mandato de poder, el fondo tiene el mandato de implementar acciones climáticas, 50% de estas de mitigación y 50% de adaptación. Entonces, es bien importante que sepamos a dónde va este dinero, como dijo Kimaren, como dijo Vicky, porque muchas de estas acciones climáticas van a territorios indígenas y en muchos casos no nos damos cuenta de cuánto llega, cómo llega, quién implementa y si los pueblos indígenas son o no son parte de los sistemas de gobernanza de estas estructuras. Entonces, el monitoreo consideramos es primordial, y el monitoreo también no solo implica este monitoreo, como van a ver, del seguimiento de pueblos indígenas al Fondo Verde, sino también significa que nos involucremos en los procesos a nivel nacional, que sepamos quiénes son nuestras autoridades nacionales que están en el Fondo Verde y poder establecer una relación con ellas, establecer también una relación con las entidades acreditadas, que son esas entidades que tienen el acceso a fondos, porque pues, para pueblos indígenas la estructura no es amigable. Y por eso nosotros hemos visto, el Fondo Verde tiene 190 proyectos aprobados que dicen que van enfocados a, y creo que 1.9 billones de esto va enfocados a comunidades y sistemas de vida. ¿Qué significa para pueblos indígenas eso? Porque sí, para mí significa que eso debería de ir a comunidades indígenas, pero no hay ningún dato oficial, como dijo Kimaren. Los pueblos indígenas están invisibles en la agenda del tema climático, de finanzas de clima en el Fondo Verde. Con esta idea es que se crea esta herramienta de seguimiento, que es el seguimiento de pueblos indígenas a los fondos. Van a ver en el video, es una página web donde ustedes pueden encontrar aquellos proyectos que nosotros, que el equipo que da seguimiento al Fondo Verde considera que tienen algún impacto positivo o negativo en territorios indígenas. Y van a encontrar un mapa donde hay información sobre qué países están. Ustedes pueden ir a los países, revisar cuáles son esas propuestas de financiamiento aprobadas y ver, también los manda a la página del Fondo Verde para ver la propuesta, pero también hay comentarios de los pueblos indígenas, porque cuando nosotros damos seguimiento en el fondo, pedimos a nuestros socios a nivel nacional si hay algún comentario sobre este proyecto. Entonces pueden ver eso, y el otro punto es que también si no han hecho comentarios, hay una opción en la página web donde pueden poner sus comentarios. ¿Sí? Y creo que ahora sí podemos ir con el video.
As the Green Climate Fund is funding more climate projects, it is critical to look at how it is implementing its own Indigenous peoples policy in terms of assessing, approving, and monitoring approved projects. It is therefore imperative to look at the GCF portfolio to date and understand how many projects are going to be implemented in Indigenous peoples' territories, what these projects look like, and how they are likely to impact Indigenous peoples.
It is important to monitor, evaluate, and report on how climate change actions are being implemented in Indigenous peoples' territories to ensure that these actions will do no harm and will not violate the rights of Indigenous peoples. We are launching the Indigenous Peoples Tracker as a contribution of Tebtebba and the ILEPA partnership in ensuring that Indigenous peoples are better informed and more proactive in their engagements with governments, financial entities, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
The Indigenous Peoples Tracker on GCF project aims to establish a baseline, analyze and monitor GCF-approved projects that will potentially impact Indigenous peoples positively or negatively. The tracker is important to see how Indigenous peoples' rights are being fulfilled in all climate actions, using the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the standard.
The GCFIP Tracker is an initiative of Indigenous people that aim to inform policies and action of the Green Climate Fund. It also aims a platform of exchange between and among Indigenous people on the GCF-funded project.
If you know any GCF-financed projects or programs being conceptualized or implemented in your territories, and you have questions, comments, complaints, or recommendations, please feel free to reach out and contribute to our Indigenous Peoples Tracker on GCF project by visiting us in the website below or emailing us directly your questions, comments, or recommendations on the pertinent projects.
One of the una de las cosas importantes que se identificó en este primer análisis en el equipo de LATIA es que 1/3 de las propuestas de financiamiento están afectando a territorios y pueblos indígenas. Entonces, por eso es importante, y eso significa, si hay 190 proyectos, pues es un número considerable. Y es necesario entonces por eso dar seguimiento, porque la lógica del tema de finanzas climáticas es dejar de hacer negocios como solamente se hacen y hacer el bien, pero siempre estamos pensando que es necesario ir más allá y que estas propuestas de financiamiento que se están aprobando tengan una participación plena y efectiva de los pueblos y que además se piense en hacer el bien en estos procesos en nuestros territorios. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Eileein. And that's very, very clear. By the way, the video that was presented was a joint initiative of Tebtebba and ELATIA partners. So ELATIA, our speakers here are members of this ELATIA network. ELATIA is a Maasai indigenous word that means global neighborhood. So it's composed of 19 indigenous peoples organizations from 13 countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So it's really a global neighborhood. And it's the ELATIA network is working around implementing indigenous people's sustainable and self-determined development, including recognition and protection of indigenous rights to lands, territories, and resources, also empowering women and youth, and strengthening governance systems and land rights, including traditional knowledge. So thank you so much, Eileein. Our next speaker is the Executive Director of Center for Indigenous Cultures in Peru. Tarcila Rivera is going to tell us more about Indigenous women's access to climate finance and challenges of Indigenous women in accessing, because within Indigenous peoples, there are also different intersectionalities, and one of which is Indigenous women. Tarcila, the floor is yours.
Gracias. ¿Está mi? Ya, ok. Soy del pueblo quechua chanca de Ayacucho en Perú y principalmente dedicada al activismo por los derechos, mirando justamente la necesidad de lograr el equilibrio en las relaciones entre los miembros de la familia y en nuestra sociedad. De acuerdo a lo que estamos conversando aquí, el tema de los fondos es algo que flota en el aire cuando hablamos del impacto y de las oportunidades que las mujeres y los pueblos indígenas pueden obtener desde las comunidades hacia arriba. Hay hasta este momento grandes discusiones justamente sobre las barreras que no hacen posible el acceso a estos fondos. En ese sentido, vemos una gran responsabilidad de parte de los estados de cumplir con los compromisos internacionales y su implementación en el escenario nacional. Eso es un gran desafío. En ese escenario, cuando hablamos del impacto de cambio climático y pueblos indígenas, no podemos ver un solo lado. Impacta la vida de las mujeres y las generaciones indígenas en forma integral, multidimensional e intergeneracionalmente. Esto quiere decir, por ejemplo, cuando las mujeres y los pueblos indígenas decimos que tenemos conocimientos que compartir para la mitigación y la adaptación, no solo estamos pensando en las generaciones de hoy y mañana, sino en los poseedores de esos conocimientos, como las mujeres mayores, por ejemplo, que tienen información a través de la práctica y la vida sobre cómo tener semillas que resisten al cambio climático. Y este aspecto es relacionado con lo que pasa en el mundo. El mundo dice que hace falta alimentos. Y entonces, ¿por qué no se ve como un potencial el recuperar, fortalecer y proyectar estos conocimientos que son aportes, por ejemplo, para la solución del problema del hambre? Del mismo modo, podríamos hablar cuando vemos el tema de la salud y las plantas medicinales. Eso es un aspecto. Pero también tiene que ver mucho con lo que los estados deben tener en cuenta en su compromiso de la Agenda 2030. ¿Cómo van a lograr un desarrollo sostenible para todos si es que no tienen una decisión política de frenar justamente la expropiación y el daño que ocasionan cuando piensan en el desarrollo económico del país, que está principalmente basado en actividades económicas y en las industrias extractivas? Cuando vemos los escenarios andinos y amazónicos, por ejemplo, de Latinoamérica, y cuando vemos el mundo, nosotras, las mujeres, escuchamos testimonios tan terribles como, por ejemplo, que los padres de familia en algún lugar de la Amazonía entregan a sus niñas de 13 años a varones adultos. Es muy simple decir que es una tradición. No es una tradición entregar a una niña menor de edad para que alguien adulto se haga cargo de ella. Cuando uno habla con esas familias, ¿cuál es la respuesta? La respuesta es que en la zona hay mayor presencia de inversionistas para la agroexportación, llámese frutas u otras alternativas. De la Amazonía del Brasil venimos escuchando, por ejemplo, cuando se quejaban de la toma de tierras para la plantación de canolas. ¿A quiénes afecta? Afecta a esas familias. Los padres dicen, las niñas cuando empiezan a menstruar pueden embarazarse y no quisiéramos recibir a la niña y al hijo porque ya no tenemos con qué mantenerlos. El bosque ya no tiene animales, ya no hay frutas naturales y no tenemos dinero para responder a la necesidad de alimento de esas personas que crecen junto con nosotros. Entonces, el aspecto de la pobreza, que es un nuevo elemento que la propia necesidad de hacer crecer económicamente al país amenaza la vida y la continuidad de las familias en las comunidades. Y esto también está relacionado, por ejemplo, Vicky nos dijo de los bosques, digamos, vírgenes o primarios que le llaman. ¿Quiénes cuidan? ¿Quiénes protegen? Los traficantes de animales exóticos, los que necesitan las maderas más nuevas, son las que aprovechan la pobreza de nuestra propia gente para que se lleven y talen árboles que tienen más de 100, 150 años. Yo voy a terminar esta parte poniendo un ejemplo que me gustaría que se les quede. Las mujeres amazónicas del sur usan el fruto de un árbol, que es el guairuro. Son unas pepitas rojas y negras. Cuando uno va a comprarles las pepitas, ellas dicen, ya no tenemos estas pepitas y ya no podemos hacer los collares. Y ahora la alternativa que hay son las pepas de plástico que viene, ya saben ustedes de dónde, de China. Y estas pepitas son de un árbol que se llama guairuro y tiene la corteza roja. Y saben que los taladores ilegales y los madereros están tirando abajo el árbol del guairuro y ellas, ¿cómo van a continuar con la generación de su economía y la proyección de sus conocimientos y la vida en su contexto? El tema de la pobreza que impacta a las mujeres indígenas está relacionado con múltiples aspectos que hay que tomar en cuenta cuando hablamos qué es lo que pasa en las comunidades. Sí me gustaría que los fondos llegaran, ¿para qué? Para que las mujeres y las comunidades enfrenten ese nuevo desafío, que es defenderse a las nuevas cosas que llegan, ¿no? La necesidad de aprender a usar el dinero, la necesidad de desarrollar capacidades locales para gestionar, pero sobre todo la necesidad de empoderarse en derechos. Y los derechos humanos deben corresponder a todos, incluyendo en la mirada del cambio climático y los grandes fondos que están volando en el aire como las hojas de otoño en este país. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Tarcila. That was powerful. Yeah, I agree that there's a need for us really to collectively change narratives in terms of monitoring what is impactful when we talk about climate finance. Monitoring climate finance is usually monitored in terms of, for adaptation, the number of beneficiaries or the scope in terms of geographical area. Or for mitigation, it's usually monitored in terms of the CO2 equivalent that is mitigated. But very beautifully, Tarcila has shown us how Indigenous women look at monitoring climate actions differently in terms of how traditional knowledge should be included as a prime indicator for them to, in her word, for Indigenous women to face the new challenges that they have to do in defending their territories, for this traditional knowledge to be transmitted to the younger generation. Thank you so much for that, Tarcila. But of course, we are not, Indigenous peoples are not able to do this alone without, of course, the support and collective action of all of us who are in this room. And for our last speaker, I'm going to call on Jennifer Corpuz from Tero. Jennifer will share to us what Indigenous people support organization like Tero, which is a non-government organization working to support Indigenous people's protection, to help Indigenous peoples in monitoring climate actions, and in particular, climate finance. Jennifer?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Helen. I am joined here by a colleague from Tero, so he will answer the questions. I will just present. So I would like to talk about 3 different functions of Indigenous support organizations like Tero, which is a US-based foundation dedicated to supporting Indigenous guardianship or Indigenous people's management, governance of their territories. So the first function, of course, we are a support organization, so we support Indigenous peoples. And this includes providing spaces for Indigenous peoples to strategize around some of the key policy issues that are being faced, that we are facing at the global level. We also support advocacy of Indigenous peoples at these spaces. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So it's important for us to support Indigenous peoples to come to these spaces so that they are able to articulate what their advocacies are. This also includes help in advocacy for direct finance to Indigenous peoples. No? So wherever we go, for example, we were asked by the UK government to participate here in this COP for the Climate and the Forests Day, Indigenous Peoples and Forests Day. And we said that it has to be Indigenous leaders. So we pushed very strongly for Indigenous leaders to be included in the panels for that day. And we were very pleased to see that Indigenous peoples had a strong presence there. And even the world leaders were talking about Indigenous peoples. Our second role, of course, is to, through our access to spaces that Indigenous peoples normally don't have access to, we influence those spaces in order to raise their awareness about Indigenous peoples, and as I said, to push for direct support to Indigenous peoples. So Tero is involved in 2 of the big announcements these past few weeks. The first one is the Protecting Our Planet Challenge that Vicky mentioned earlier. So in Protect Our Planet Challenge, there's a 5 billion fund. It's not just for Indigenous peoples, but it's a commitment to support 30 by 30, the achievement of more ambitious conservation targets. And our presence there is very clear for us that the reason we are there is in order to to campaign for direct access of Indigenous peoples, but for Indigenous peoples to have a bigger slice of the pie. The second announcement that we are involved in as Tero is the 1.7 billion pledge that was announced last week to support Indigenous peoples in tropical forests. And the objective there is the same, no? It's for us to raise awareness on Indigenous peoples and to push for the development of principles and safeguards for Indigenous peoples. What does this involve? This involves, at least for us, what we want to do is for Indigenous peoples to be able to monitor and track how this 5 billion pledge and the 1.7 billion pledge is being used to support Indigenous peoples. So it includes tracking exactly how much of that fund goes to Indigenous peoples. And it also involves looking at how these entities that have joined these pledges, how they uphold Indigenous peoples' rights in accordance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And of course, if there are cases of non-compliance, we are also pushing for a grievance mechanism that could address instances of non-compliance. Of course, we are a foundation, so we receive funds. And one of the things that we do as Tero is to, as much as possible, absorb the administrative difficulties, in administering these funds and give them to indigenous people so that they are able to be as flexible as possible. These funds are, because when funders give us money, they're always about measurements, how do we monitor the impact of the money that we are giving you? And for indigenous peoples, we don't necessarily align our governance structures with the timelines of funders. So what we did is to develop a biocultural monitoring mechanism that develops monitoring from the point of view of indigenous peoples, much the same way as the Indigenous Navigator is doing. So what we are saying is that it's not only about the amount of carbon sequestered, the number of species conserved. It's also about the intangible things for indigenous peoples. To what extent are they able to practice their rituals, for example? To what extent do they feel they have agency in implementing their life plans, plan de vida? So those are what we put in the, and I have to say that our monitoring mechanism is also inspired by the Indigenous Navigator, among others. And then, which brings me to the last function of support organizations. So our last, well, let me see. Oh, there was one more. Under absorbing funds, the administrative difficulties, and providing flexibility to our partners, capacity building is also important for us. So we build the capacities of indigenous peoples to be able to absorb the funds. But once this capacity building is conducted or successfully implemented, then our last function is to get out of the way. So indigenous peoples have to be the ones actually doing all of these things. We are here to support, but obsolescence is in our DNA. We are very much aware that we're a US-based foundation. The administrative costs of maintaining our organization are high. And we are always aware that this amount of money can do so much in indigenous communities. So I wanted to end my presentation with that message. Ultimately, our function is to move out of the way so that indigenous peoples can step in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Your presentation actually responds to many elements of the call of indigenous peoples, not only for this COP, but also for in other gathering where there's a call for direct access of indigenous peoples to climate finance. There are the elements and questions about how direct should it be, and also in terms of building capacity, enhancing capacities of indigenous peoples to be able to manage and administer these funds. And of course, these are very welcome information and announcement. And I would take it also as a challenge to other foundations and other support organizations to follow the lead. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are now opening the floor for our questions and answers, and also for comments, if any. So I see one here and one at the back. I'll get two of the questions first, and then see if there are others. Yes, please. And before you do, please also introduce your self and your organization. You don't have to do anything with the microphone. They should be
Thank
ready.
you. This is Chanchana Jakma. I am from Chittagong Hill Tracks. It's southeast of Bangladesh. I am member secretary of Bangladesh Indigenous Women Network and member of Bangladesh Indigenous People Forum. I would like to comment and question. I'm taking 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, sorry for that. Actually, in Chittagong Hill Tracks and Plainland, there have a lot of in Chittagong Hill Tracks. There have a lot of forests. We are protecting our forests, but forest department they declare they have a amendment in law. They will be the reserve forest. But we indigenous people all are the belief that the common land and shifting cultivation in Chittagong Hill Tracks and plainland. And plainland, those who are living in forest hill area, especially near the tea garden, they are planting the betel nut and betel leaf and other sources of income, especially involve the indigenous women there, their income. And in Chittagong Hill Tracts, we collect the natural food from the forest, natural resource. But in this time, due to the reservation forest, indigenous women cannot collect, especially during the COVID situation. Actually, they didn't collect their vegetable or other things for the, especially some of indigenous women, they are main income sources. And those who are protecting forests and human rights activists and indigenous women, they are very danger in this time in Chittagong Hill Tracts due to the militarization. And we are fighting long time for self-determination and land rights in Chittagong Hill Tracts. Those who know about the Chittagong Hill Tracts, they know that we have a accord, CST accord, we call between government and CST people, but this accord is still not implementation. Because of that, we are having violence against indigenous women there. We have recorded 761 cases. No one cases we didn't access justice there due to the forest protects. And that's why I would like to question the, how we involve with the climate finance and in Bangladesh Indigenous Women Network and Bangladesh Indigenous People Forum, because it's very important for us. The forest department, especially in plainland, those who are the harvesting crops, they are destroying their crops. Also, one of the indigenous disabled women sees income only that harvest that crops, but forest department destroyed their harvesting and everything. We have visited there. Okay, that's why I would like to question how we involved with this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sister. We have one at the back, and then, okay, no, yes, the woman first. Yeah, the lady first, yes, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shirley Rodriguez. I represent Generation Atomic. It's an advocacy for energy in the US. I'm originally from Peru, one of the poorest cities of Peru, and I build and try to get as much knowledge as I can. And I became an engineer when I was 21 years old, which is very unusual in my country. So, and when I see the title of International Indigenous People Forum for Climate Change, I wanted to ask the panelists, how have we improved in regards with education and climate change? Because a lot of people seem that they don't have the access to data. They will verify with evidence how we are declining and how important it is for people to learn about climate change, how we can fight it, and what can we do to make sure we keep going in this path of decarbonization. And also for Tarcila, una pregunta para ti. ¿Cómo crees que la cultura de educación en Perú ha cambiado desde hace 20 años atrás hasta ahora? En respecto con el cambio climático, por supuesto. Gracias.
Thank you so much. And I'll have one more before I turn it over to our, okay, there was Chief, yeah, the Chief first, and then we will come back to you after we hear from our panelists. Yeah.
Chief Kukoy Tony James from Guyana, South America. I represent 21 communities from the Wapchan Nation. Since ARICOP meeting here, this meeting of countries all over the place, and information that we have been sharing, it's very good, especially for us who are in the forest. And it is very disturbing to come till here to hear about initiatives like LEAF and those other things, which we don't know about. And we are very worried that our governments have already come here and already started to apply, or whatever the process is, how can these finances meet to the community itself? Because I totally agree, because, you know, like Vicky, you said, is the crumbs that reach there, if at all.
Mhm.
And it is important because we are the people who are jumping up and defending the forest. And we are not defending it because we want to defend it, but it's for our future generations and for humanity on the whole.
Yeah.
So it is important to get these kind of information down to these grassroots organizations so that they would have an input into the processes and systems, or how the finances could reach down there so that we can continue to live a little more longer on the face of this earth.
I'll get one last question and then we give the floor to our, okay. No. Okay, what we're going to do is give the floor to our speakers first. I'd like to ask Tarcila to respond to that question about Peru, and Jennifer to respond about the leaf related question, and Vicky to respond on the CHT question. And then we come back for another round. Tarcila?
Ok. El tema de, tenemos dos aspectos en el tema de educación. La educación pública al pueblo, al público en general, que debería recibir información clara y precisa sobre lo que pasa en el mundo y los compromisos de nuestros estados para que podamos justamente con esa información incidir frente a la política del Estado. Sin embargo, eso no pasa. Las iniciativas de educación pública están relacionadas con las organizaciones de sociedad civil que hacen su esfuerzo y no es de gran impacto porque tenemos acciones limitadas. El tema de la educación formal desde el Estado no incluye los conocimientos indígenas en la educación formal. Y principalmente cuando hablamos de indígenas que acceden a la educación formal pública, lamentablemente sienten y sufren una ruptura entre su vida práctica de la teta de donde vienen a lo que es la educación formal. No estamos hablando nada nuevo, ¿no? Necesitamos sí apoyo, por ejemplo, para desarrollar iniciativas que puedan contribuir a las políticas de educación intercultural en países multiculturales y multilingües como la mayoría de los estados. Y donde el esfuerzo viene de nosotros, tratar de incidir en la política educativa nacional del Estado, que se incluyan los conocimientos indígenas en esa educación formal, porque de lo contrario, los no indígenas no conocen nada y siguen siendo racistas y discriminadores, y nuestras niñas y niños salen de la escuela secundaria teniendo vergüenza de ser indígena. Todo eso tiene que cambiar. El tema del cambio climático, los derechos humanos, derechos de pueblos indígenas, derechos de mujeres, pedimos que sea parte de la currícula educativa en los estados multiculturales.
Thank you very much, Tarcila. Jennifer?
Thank you very much. And thanks, Chief Kokoy, for the question. And indeed, maybe for those who in the audience who don't know about the LEAF initiative, it's an initiative related to the voluntary carbon markets, no? And you also know that Article 6 is one of the hot topics of negotiations here. And it's an effort to develop rules for carbon markets at the international level. So it's developing mechanisms, and currently there is language around Indigenous people's rights, human rights and Indigenous people's rights. So obviously the LEAF initiatives like LEAF and others, like the voluntary carbon markets in Brazil, in California, in other places, they are emerging because there is a demand. No, there is a demand. And as long as there are no rules at the international level, it's difficult to standardize how they are supposed to be treating Indigenous people. So under LEAF, it's like a matching system, no? It commits to producing high integrity emission reductions, no? Because in the Kyoto Protocol Clean Develop Mechanism previously, the credits there were not very high integrity. So this time they're trying to fix that, no? And they have committed to comply with the Cancun safeguards. So, and there was a call for proposals, and those proposals were already screened and selected. And unfortunately, there was some confusion because there was supposed to be the possibility of direct access by Indigenous peoples to LEAF. So there were some Indigenous organizations that submitted proposals. However, currently, it has been resolved that it is still taking a jurisdictional approach. So only countries or subnational governments can submit. So this LEAF has an Indigenous advisory panel, and I am one of the members of that advisory panel. And one of the things that we have been telling them is that Indigenous peoples have to know about what LEAF is. And before the deadline of the submission, there were information sessions organized, and COICA was the one that organized for Latin America. No? So there were informational sessions there, and that's precisely why some Indigenous peoples in Latin America submitted. What we are struggling for now, since there is no possibility of direct submission by Indigenous peoples, what we are trying to do now is to try to paint for them a picture for how they need to comply with the Cancun safeguards. And this means that the jurisdictions have to obtain consent of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have to be full partners with the jurisdictions. No? So at the moment, there are a few countries that have signed the letter of intent, but the full actual exchange of money won't happen for a while yet. And while that is pending, there is this requirement that the jurisdictions should bring Indigenous peoples on board. I'm not sure if Guyana is included. I will find that out for you. And you know, Nepal, I already talked to the Indigenous peoples in Nepal and a couple of other countries because they really need to be brought into the proposals as full players, full partners.
Thank you, Jing. And I'm sure Jing will be also very happy to provide more information about this after the event. So Vicky, about the question of how Indigenous women in the Chittagong hill tracts in Bangladesh could also be engaged in the discussions around climate finance.
Thank you. Well, maybe just before I go there, I just wanted to answer on the awareness raising of Indigenous peoples also on climate change. You know, in Tebtebba, we do trainings for young Indigenous peoples. In fact, we held one that was just for Bangladesh. No, many of the participants, we had a lot of participants, young ones and women as well. And so they were able to take part in the training on what is climate change, what are the points being negotiated, why are we concerned about climate change. So we do that regularly because we believe that if we are able to train the young people and bring them here, then they will be able to really of course, influence their government, but also come here to talk about their issues like you. I know that we also supported the Bangladesh Indigenous Women's Forum through the Pawanka Fund, no, and where we also provided you with support so that you will be able to do some of the things that you have written to us. You know, I've been to Chittagong Hill Tract several times. It's one of the places I visited. Even before I was the rapporteur, I think that was like 20 years ago. But I did see how militarized that whole country is and how there were many rape cases against Indigenous women, which have never been resolved, no, up to now. And that's really terrible because we tried to launch campaign. We set up the CHT Commission, and this CHT Commission wanted to work, you know, at the UN level to get the UN not to hire Bangladeshi military to be in the peacekeeping forces because they are committing these crimes against Indigenous women. So I think there are a lot that we need to do, of course, to continue to train. And you link with us. We know you. We can provide you all the information that you need, as well as link you to the groups that need to, you know, that need that kind of support. And finally, just to say, you know, there is, I think, 100 Bangladeshi people here, both from the CSOs, no? And I don't know why, but I think it's because of the loss and damage discussions as well. You know, Bangladesh is under threat of being, you know, many of their places will be sinking, and they will bring their people to Chittagong Hill Tracts because that's in the uplands. No, so that's also the problem. You know, that adverse impacts in the lowlands will definitely affect indigenous peoples in the highlands, you know, and so those are some of the issues that really need to be tackled here. But thank you very much for coming and sharing those with us.
Thank you. Yeah, we can continue our discussion. Yeah, so because I saw two questions, two hands. May we have you no, Tom first and then.
Thank you.
It's working, yes.
Thank you, Tom Griffiths, Forest Peoples Programme. Thanks to the presenters and very clear message of this need to unpack these pledges of finance. What do they really consist of? Is it really new funding? So that idea of a kind of tabulated inventory or list, I think is a brilliant idea. And of course, the accountability. And I just want to pick up on the LEAF. Yes, the government of Guyana has applied to LEAF. It's been registered. And it's arguable that, in fact, they've already violated FPIC. So the donors and others involved in that, where is the accountability there? I mean, FPIC is meant to be prior. And it's also the mechanism of FPIC, because the government of Guyana has one understanding that it only applies to titled land. What about the untitled lands under claim? Those are what they call state forests. So these are fundamental rights issues at stake. But I just want to make the question to the panelists. There's been big announcements here from the government. What is the follow-up after COP26? Will the state donors, the bilaterals and the multilaterals, set up a inclusive working group on how that fund would be spent, and the philanthropics foundations? Will they do the same, transparent, inclusive working groups? I would not say consultative group. That already implies they're just going to consult you. An actual working group where indigenous peoples are leading it on what is the governance of those funds. Thank you.
Thank you. And our young people.
Mi nombre es Isabel Pasos. Trabajo en la Coordinadora de Mujeres Líderes Territoriales de Mesoamérica. Y yo quisiera preguntar a las panelistas si han buscado o pensado que también se puede monitorear algunas herramientas nuevas e innovadoras para acceder a mecanismos financieros o flexibilizar mecanismos financieros. Por ejemplo, siempre estamos diciendo de que llega muy poco dinero de los fondos climáticos a los territorios y sabemos que el porcentaje y es realmente abrumador pensar en 1% y de eso cuánto llega a las mujeres, que es el área con la que yo trabajo, también es un poco frustrante. Pero ¿por qué si hemos sido hermanos dialogando juntos para estar en esta convención y participar y hacer incidencia política, también es importante conversar y unirnos para crear mecanismos financieros nuevos? ¿Por qué no creamos una unidad, por ejemplo, unidades administrativas? Porque generalmente la gran dificultad de los fondos grandes climáticos es poder implementar en el territorio, porque los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales no tienen las capacidades financieras de grandes operadores o ONG grandes en el mundo, y a veces a estas ONG grandes que quieren acompañarnos, que quieren implementar con nosotros, también les cuesta ejecutar proyectos con nosotros. Entonces, si queremos pensar en fortalecimiento de capacidades, también tenemos que pensar en fortalecimiento de capacidades financieras, acompañado de mecanismos financieros dedicados, exclusivos a pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales y todos los pueblos, ¿verdad? Pero realmente pensar en una unidad financiera adaptada a esas necesidades. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I'm going to give that question to Eileein and Kimaren, and also come back to Jing on the question about the LEAF initiative.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Gracias, Isabel, por la pregunta. Realmente creo que sí es importante el tema de la... I'm sorry. El tema de generar estas capacidades, mejorar las capacidades existentes y generar esta sociedad, ese partnership con otros en nuestra región o a nivel global. Pero creo que también tenemos que apuntar un poco más allá. Porque está siempre hablando de trabajar a través de otras ONG, pero creo que es importante el tema de que los mismos pueblos indígenas lideren, y hay experiencias muy buenas de cómo los pueblos indígenas están liderando procesos y mecanismos de financiamiento. Tenemos el fondo Podali en Brasil, está el fondo Pahuanca, que puedes ver ahí, y creo que son estas estructuras que tenemos que analizar y estudiar y cómo replicarlas en nuestros territorios, en nuestras regiones, porque puedes ver que son procesos liderados por pueblos indígenas en todo el personal que también han adaptado su estructura a la realidad de las comunidades, ¿verdad? En el tema de los llamados, en el tema de tener este do delivery, pero que sea cultural, ¿verdad? Y no este financiero que muchas organizaciones están buscando. Entonces creo que hay experiencias muy ricas, como te estaba contando fuera antes, hay experiencias muy ricas y sí estamos haciendo el análisis porque consideramos que es importante replicar esto en los diferentes niveles y esa sociedad entre todas las organizaciones indígenas es importante.
Thank you very much. By the way, we only have 4 minutes, so if we can, do it.
Thank you very
rapidly.
much. And I think in terms of capacity, we have the technical capacity, but we also have the organizational capacity. One of the excuse actors have on indigenous people territories for not applying FPIC is they say, whom do we FPIC? And I think we got to be ahead of them in coordinating how we engage with external actors. On Tom's question, I feel like, or comment on FPIC, I feel like we are in a situation where our community says, sometimes you use a piece of cloth to hold a stinging nettle. So you prevent yourself from the sting, but you pluck it anyway. And so you have FPIC being put in policy, but there's no resources to make policy work. So I think we have to move from just a tick the box FPIC arrangement to giving it meaning on the ground. Thank you.
Jennifer?
To Tom's question, yes, 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 and yes. Let's talk after because and part of our function, that's part of our function as the Indigenous Advisory Panel is to raise these kinds of questions. So let's talk after. And just a brief comment on this. You know, when we asked them about how the safeguards would be implemented, they said, of course, it would depend on the national law. So we said, no, that is not sufficient. These are global safeguards. And the way that the World Bank implements them is that it doesn't matter whether the national government has laws on the indigenous peoples or not, whether the indigenous peoples have recognized land tenure rights or not, as long as they are fulfilling the criteria of who indigenous peoples are, the safeguards should be applied. And they took it well. So let's follow up. Thanks.
And maybe just to also respond and sort of close our session for today, I'm going to call on both Vicky and Tarcila. So, okay.
Okay. The point of the question of Tam in terms of where do we go from here? You know, I think that we really have to put our acts together, both indigenous peoples and allies, to really shape a whole plan on how to make sure that these funds are going to be used the right way. I think we also have to have a listing of where these funds should go, because you know, while we are talking about you know, some of these the funds should go first to setting up the right regulatory frameworks. That's why we are fighting here for tenure rights, you know, because even if you know, I mean, all these people, they will say, you don't have a national law. So we have to fight for a national law that protects indigenous people's rights, and that requires a lot of money I know that because in the Philippines, it really made years and years and a lot of money for us to come up with the Indigenous People's Rights Act, no? And secondly, of course, all the activities that need to be supported, whether this is from mapping, buying the technologies, paying the consultants for us to be able to account for these funds, of course, the economic benefits for the communities, as well as setting up the schools and the health systems. You know, it's a whole range of things that need to be funded. And while they may say it's not connected to climate fund, or climate change, these are all related to climate change. So I think that's the challenge for all of us. And I hope that the monitoring that we are all talking about will really look into all this. That's why the UN Declaration is really the framework, because every article there, you have to check whether they have violated or respected it, no? And setting those standards, these international standards that should be used by the countries whenever they talk about Indigenous peoples is really the way to go. In that way, we will be able to empower our own people, really make them aware about what their rights are, and making sure that they get the benefits that they need to give because of that. You know, we are doing much more, as I mentioned, about the 11 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions that are sequestered by our forests. That is trillions of dollars. You know, the money that they are providing to us is nothing compared to the value of all the ecosystems we are providing to the world, no? But and then you have this financial industry who also have like 130 trillion. They said 400 trillion to commit to climate change, and those are the people who are in the leaf and all these things. So we really need to see, you know, see the proper perspective, put the balance in all these finances, and really monitor and scold them if they are not doing the right thing.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much to our very powerful speakers, panel speakers, also to everyone here, our interpreters, our tech people, and also our participants virtually. So indeed, dedicated climate financing is needed by Indigenous peoples, not only for climate mitigation and adaptation, but more importantly, also to correct the climate injustice that we are experiencing. Thank you so much and have a great day, everyone.